with the webinar Resilience in the Middle of the Storm, Preparing Security Teams for Disaster, and especially in these pandemic times. My name is Stephen Marshowitz. I'm the Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec. And before I forget, wanted to let everyone know that this is being recorded and it'll be available on our website under events. And also make sure you ask questions. There's a Q&A section there. We'll be getting to the questions throughout the webinar, so feel free to ask at any time if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear or see or understand as we move along. Just a little bit about TrustedSec. There we go. TrustedSec starts with with the most challenging aspects of security, and that's really understanding the real world effectiveness of your security controls and how that applies to your security program, compliance, business risk tolerances, etc. We have services ranging from advice on building your program, testing it, remediating it, and then of course, responding to incidents. One of the interesting things about TrustedSec is really we're very different than most organizations. We have, for the vast majority of our consultants are senior level folks. And I really appreciate that every day. We have amazing talent. You know, we really do quite a bit. We have tremendous research that we add to the teams on exploits, hacking techniques, emerging technologies, standards and different approaches. And I often find myself actually saying, how in the heck did you know that? Like, how would they know these things? There's so many amazing things that people are really just on top of. So as we always say at TrustedSec, feel free to call us anytime with questions. You know, no one person knows all there is to know about security compliance, so we'll definitely get you and point you in the right direction. So with that, I want to start off with Rockie Brockway. Rockie, can you tell a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. So Rockie Brockway, I am the practice lead of the Office of the CSO here at TrustedSec, running our Chief Security Officer Solution Group, which essentially is focused in on security program building, business risk assessment. We've been, over the past few years, working very heavily within the MITRE ATT&CK framework to help organizations understand effectiveness. And I've been in the industry very long time, and hopefully in June, the little security conference that I also run, besides Cleveland, hopefully we will have that under the circumstances.
Yep. And I'll go next here. Justin Leapline. I currently lead the PCI practice here. Before that, I'd led a number of different organizations, including the largest e-commerce in Pittsburgh, which was giftcards.com. I was director of security there. And for Diebold, I led up the security governance compliance, really involved in a lot of the high-level oversight and security aspects into a number of different things. And obviously business continuity and a lot of the aspects to that fell under me under various parts in those organizations. So excited to talk about this today.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. That was fantastic. Really appreciate all that you guys do. So, you know, pandemics are not your normal business disruption. You know, things unfold over months. They happen over longer periods of time, and really there's an uncertain length of time and an uncertain future. So we'll discuss some of the things you should have done, still need to do, but also what to do in the middle of the storm, as we brought that up earlier in kind of the title. And they are strange days indeed. You know, we're getting all kinds of different things that we're hearing about. Of course, the crazy toilet paper runs. All circuits are busy. Even in this doing this webinar, which we typically do on site. I'm already having internet connections, but just less than 2 years ago, 2 months ago, very few of us would really be saying, hey, you know, or there's going to be a crash in the markets, or we can't get our businesses to get up and running, and kids are getting sprayed from head to toe with sanitizer, and of course, you know, a lot of the service industry is down now, and they're closed. So businesses are closing, people are losing their jobs, and it's really been such a unbelievable time in our history, and something we'll hopefully look back at that, you know, was successfully overcome. But right now, as we are going through it, it is really changing some of the things that we have to think about, and certainly rearranging our priorities. So with that, we'll start it off with business continuity. And certainly that's, you know, the number one thing. How do we keep the continuity of operations going? And where do we begin with that?
So business continuity planning is a crucial aspect of an organization's security program. And, you know, from a who needs to be involved perspective, it's pretty much the usual suspects, right? Representation from leadership, HR, legal, IT, obviously, and security. But, you know, okay, what does this really mean? And you know, when kind of talking about something like this, where we're in today with, you know, a pandemic, you know, some of the things that we need to consider are, okay, what roles do we need to support remotely, and what assets do they actually need to you know, to utilize to accomplish their tasks? This tends to be actually something that a lot of organizations find difficult, just given the fact that many organizations do not have strong asset or portfolio ownership or even inventories, right? These are weak points. So part of the continuity planning to really reduce, you know, whatever overarching financial ramifications and impact something like today, you know, the scenario that we're in today, you know, affects the organization. These things need to be talked about. And, you know, the unfortunate reality is that many organizations haven't really thought about that. So that becomes a really, really crucial aspect of this. What happens if we can't access certain systems that, you know, financially impact the business, right? You talk about things like critical infrastructure. So a lot of the, I would say, you know, standard organizations in the financial industry or things of that nature have the ability to kind of push their workforce remotely, but a lot of them don't, right? So how does that affect the organization? And lastly, especially from a business perspective, leadership really needs to assess the liquidity of the business, because, you know, right now we're being told a number of different things. This could maybe last, you know, 12 to 18 months, or maybe it's just another month or so, given some of the progress on existing drugs that have been, you know, shown to at least reduce the severity of this particular pandemic. So yeah, from a business perspective, you know, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Justin.
No, you were talking about the malaria drug that they were thinking that reduces some of the symptoms.
Yeah, and there's also an AIDS drug that I think, now I'm going to kind of, you know, floating out of my comfort zone, but I think it was Japan. I think it was Japan that also said, or also discovered that, you know, there was an AIDS drug that was really kind of, you know, taking the teeth out of this a little bit, out of COVID-19.
So Rocky, you know, if somebody's have never done a business impact analysis, what do you recommend for them to like get started? You know, it's probably like a lot of small to mid-sized companies that's never done this before. Is there any resources out there, or like where do they start? Sorry, I'm playing moderator here.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah. So right. So I look at this from the perspective that we have, obviously in IT and security, we are very, very familiar with the technical side of the organization to ensure that, you know, operations continue and ensure that, you know, operations are functioning in a secure manner. But that business impact side of the house is very much requires, having the conversations and that communication, which we'll talk about in a few more slides, but having that communication open to the business to really understand, right, what is important to the business, right? What do they feel is important, so we can align the technical side of the protections, right? But then also understanding, having the conversations about, okay, financial, let's say, loss thresholds, right? What does the business consider a critical financial loss, and what might be some of those scenarios that could lead to a significant loss?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's definitely ways to do that. Smaller businesses can have these conversations. It does get a little, I would say, more complicated for smaller organizations, but at the same time, the larger the organization, the complexity also adds, in kind of the opposite direction to the complex, being that complex, right?
Yeah, and I think, it depends on the industry and the organization, but the smaller you are, probably the less level of detail you need into it. Like, there's probably only some core services that you need to actually function from a business, especially if you're largely internet e-commerce type based, and if you're already outsourcing a lot of stuff like to the cloud and Office 365, that makes it a lot easier to manage, instead of having, servers in house that people have to connect back to and everything. One thing that I did want to mention, I often, NIST is obviously a great resource, and they have one that's 834 version that talks about doing contingency planning. And they have examples and outlines and basically data points of how to measure RTO and RPO and all this stuff that, goes into this. So those are excellent guides to download that and take a look at some of the examples that they have and everything.
Awesome. Great. So the second point that, I'll maybe lead off here with is risk modeling, right? Everybody probably listening to this podcast understands that risk is all about making the decisions on whether, this is an acceptable risk, whether it's an unacceptable risk, right? How can we reduce this? Can we transfer this out? So some of the things that I know organizations right now are, looking at and even having, issues to a degree, actually deriving actual numbers for, right? So what percentage of revenue does this particular geolocation over there represent? If that geolocation happens to be, let's say in Wuhan, that's a problem, right? And that's going to pose a significant revenue hit, provided that facility is no longer able to, let's say, produce whatever it is that organization produces. What's an acceptable percentage of infected employees per facility? I've had a couple of conversations with organizations, who are really having trouble kind of figuring out, okay, does one person mean that we should shut this facility down, or can we beef up our, let's say, personal hygiene through gloves and masks and things of that nature, and still be able to keep that facility open and reduce open at the same time, but also reducing the likelihood of additional infection. Supply chain resiliency is a huge issue, especially in manufacturing, where so many organizations rely upon their downstream partners. So getting an idea of the downstream resiliency of your supply chain, very difficult, very, very difficult. But that has to be modeled, that has to be a part of this equation. And I mentioned critical infrastructure earlier, right? It's like, okay, well, what does critical infrastructure do? Power generation, people that run power generation facilities, they probably can't a lot of the times work from home. So understanding how that affects the overarching risk, all of these combined, the overarching risks to your organization, is something that, while a lot of this is going to be fairly difficult, especially kind of like now that all of a sudden we're in this point. It has to be, it definitely has to be done. So yeah, any additional kind of points there, Justin?
No, I think you hit everything nail on the head there. But yeah, I definitely see upcoming that there'll be a lot of reconsiderations on that supply chain. I've already seen a number of articles that are evaluating, the high reliance on Chinese manufacturers and, whether that be from a manufacturing or pharmaceutical or things of that nature, just with this uncertainty to do either alternate plans or shifting around manufacturing to either bring it back to the States or some other, countries that are more stable, from this view and everything. So yeah,
even the pharma industry, a lot of our pharmaceutical prescription drugs are outsourced to China and things of the countries like that, and that represents a significant disruption and potentially could add to the I guess growing toll that we're seeing right now from the COVID-19.
Yep. Yeah, I was actually surprised to learn that was it up to like 90% of antibiotics actually come from China, and it was like 30% of pain meds and everything. So yeah,
I just read that too.
Yeah.
So from a security perspective, let's say you already have some sort of risk assessment that you've done, or you do it annually, or some sort of risk model that you've put into. How do you bring some of those things that are typically outside of what security would do? Would you recommend the security folks are talking to their management about that? They're looking for direction. How does that interaction work, would you say?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think from my perspective, working with organizations and being involved in organizations at these levels, it's a two-way street, right? To a degree, leadership really should be guiding the conversations around business continuity, around disaster recovery, around, risk modeling, and around the, black swan events like a pandemic. But the reality is that that doesn't happen a lot. The other side of that is, the security teams, the IT folk who are keeping operations running, while they may have a better idea of what let's say a geolocated facility outage would mean from a technical perspective. A lot of times in many organizations that tie into the business isn't there, right? So that's the ongoing challenge from my perspective, is that being able to better facilitate that communication between the security sides and the business is really crucial.
Yep. Yeah, and I would also add on to that. I mean, from a security perspective, we're facilitators of the risk assessment. It's really the business leaders that should own it, type of thing. So having those conversations with those executives and saying, let's set some boundaries, let's set some guidelines, let's look at some of these incidents that we're lining up. Do you see anything else, and get their buy-in and their feedback from that. Also, too, I think it's vitally important that you turn in some of these risk scenarios into actual dollar amounts, because that's what business actually looks at. So if you can both agree on to say, okay, going without email or going out without this asset, for this application or service, this is going to cost us, $5,000 an hour. Do we agree about that price? And it's yes or no, type of thing. And then it's saying, okay, now how long can we go without it that would be okay to you, Mr. Business Owner? And, they'll say, well, 3 days without us doing this will, seriously hamper that. We don't have that much money, from saving tolerance, with that. And getting that kind of buy-in and producing those results is, what's going to glue this all together. So.
We have another question. It says, I always hear expect the unexpected, but what % of revenue or liquidity are best estimates for the unknown? Like, would you say 10% extra for the added cost of hardened availability? or a call center has to pay X amount more for extra hygiene or bandwidth, or applying Chaos Monkey for Netflix to test multiple servers?
That's a really good question. And, you know, the stock answer is it depends, right? Medical organizations should really, you know, be, in my opinion, very focused on, you know, this kind of black swan event because the criticality of what they do. And you can make similar arguments to, you know, critical infrastructure, pharma, et cetera. But at the end of the day, that's going to be, it depends. I would love it if organizations, you know, part of our business model is annually 10% of our, you know, let's just, you know, deal with straight revenue, right? Annually 10% of that actually does go into something that will allow us in this low probability, high impact kind of scenario, which is virtually impossible to secure against properly. That's our backup, right? That's our cushion. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I've heard commonly that, you know, you should have, from an income perspective, 3 to 6 months to be able to cover from a pure cost perspective. You know, so I hear a lot of businesses that, like, they're trying to hit those things that they have in the bank, that if there's zero revenue coming in, that they could at least weather, you know, a lot of those short to midterm ones. And then, like we were talking about with this business continuity plan, trying to adjust process and tools and whatever that may be to accommodate and start to get revenue back in the door, type of thing.
Yep, totally.
Yeah, so another important factor that should be built into your business continuity plan is communication. And there's a couple of different things with this. So one, obviously, set up communication channels to reach all employees. Commonly seen that, you know, you have different call trees set up that have automatic notification. Typically, there's also portals set up, you know, for tools, you know. So in previous organizations, we've set up a dedicated website that we communicate from an emergency standpoint. We would actually be updating on a common basis. That's also pushed out through those communication channels with that. And also, too, having dedicated mediums with the for communication. So, you know, whether that be, you know, Slack or Teams or whatever your kind of chatting platform is, email, of course, things of that nature, just be ready to have a plan to, you know, how are you going to be communicating, how are you going to tell employees updates to what's going on and what you're doing about it. On top of that, one of the things I always recommend is have a regular cadence. So if you're in the midst of a short-term, you know, kind of crisis, look at that, and you know, you should be doing, you know, hourly, semi-hourly updates to give employees all this. You know, in this type of scenario here that we're in, I typically recommend, you know, at least twice a week, reaching out to employees to kind of give updates, you know, so like a Monday, Thursday type update or something like that, just to ensure like what you're doing, what the plan is, how you're adjusting with that. And managers, you know, always keep good contact with your employees. You know, now's the time to kind of over communicate, because there's a lot of people that are going into, you know, remote work for really the first time from a long-term basis. So ensuring that everybody's adjusting appropriately, that they're getting everything that they need from, you know, a tooling, and just seeing how everybody's doing to kind of adjust for this.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, something like these types of communication frameworks, they're really not that much different from a relatively mature incident response and disaster recovery kind of framework community, you know, with communication. You know, at what level does the CEO or legal need to get involved in at that level of an incident, or, you know, or whatever, what have you, you know, then that communication to those, you know, to those people within the organization, is that every couple of hours? Is that, you know, every 4 hours? But for a lot of organizations that do have a fairly decent and mature IR and DR set of processes already. A lot of this stuff should already be, pretty much organized the way we need it.
Yep, absolutely. One thing I will mention that, in this time where we're doing a lot more work, I definitely encourage, turning on your video for employees. It helps kind of bleed that of the in-office workers now to being all remote and kind of give that personal kind of communication still a little bit closer to that. So, okay. So lastly, I think from a business continuity perspective, crisis management. So having a dedicated team set up, and like Rocky said, this isn't all that irregular from an incident management type perspective, but having management decisions come down and organized and communicated with one voice through the organization is critical to this. Somebody that can make decisions, to adjust the process. And keep in mind, like, we're in a situation right now, but it's always things that come up that are not expected. So people need to be flexible with, what business processes are, looking at things. And there's a lot of preparation and testing that goes into these type of things. Most commonly tabletop exercises that give different scenarios of, the building burning down or partial building burning down, or, pandemic, things with people being out, but setting up all the this, and then having people talk about, communicate, and then pursuing solutions to problems is critical. Obviously, we mentioned about setting up communication paths to this. I also recommend on the reverse that employees have a way to reach back into the team here, whether that's setting up an email address that goes to the crisis management team or some type of portal submission. This way they get, up-to-date feedback to, on processes that they need help with or adjustments to, or things of that nature that, need to come up to their attention and everything. One last thing I wanted to mention is, obviously a lot of these are comprised of senior leadership and everything, but don't forget about some of the other core critical roles with this. A great example is like your head of customer service. So that would be a perfect role to be on this crisis management teams, because they are the front lines to this from your customer perspective. So consider alternate roles that should be a part of this, so you're getting the best advice on how, different decisions will impact the rest of the organization.
Yeah, that's a great point. Those types of customer service leaders, public relation leaders, things of that nature are very, very crucial to this crisis management team. And just from an overarching perspective, again, the parallels, right? So crisis management as a component of, overarching business continuity really should be guiding then from a process and framework perspective, the disaster recovery efforts, as well as then down the line, the incident response efforts. All of this should be really in line with the overarching crisis management, the overarching crisis management direction. So.
Yep.
So if people already have had, I'm sure, discussions with their management, would you recommend moving something like a tabletop up the chain, set up those types of meetings versus, what are you guys doing for security for us during these times, or what have you? How would you, best structure that to work with the management and the leaders for even those what if scenarios?
Yeah, so I'll go first. I mean, when you're actually doing those tabletop exercises, you can't do that without already the defined team. So typically in your business continuity or incident response, you're already defining team members that will be a part of that, whether it's be by, the different roles they have, like legal, HR, IT, or breaking it up into like business units, which some organizations do, whatever that may be. All of those people should be intermixed into that tabletop exercise, because the whole goal is that they're trained and know what to do at the time of the exercise, type of thing. So if you're, in previous organization, when we went through business continuity tabletop, we had all the senior leadership sitting down at the table, including, the CEO, that we went through once a year. we had a number of scenarios we run through. We give what if scenarios. We give, limitations to those scenarios. So, there's an IT issue and the head of IT is out on vacation, doesn't have a cell phone, type of thing. And you give those kind of what if scenarios, and looking at your plan, you look at to see if it's sufficient enough to actually handle those type of things. You go through what the kind of steps are that you have outlined into it. And then you look at limitations or gaps into it. Like, what didn't we address? What can we update to actually, provide more clarification? Or we didn't consider, something that somebody wouldn't have access from a communication standpoint. So how would we, do we have a succession tree, type of thing, that if this person's out, this is the next person to go to, things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, all of this really ties into, security program maturity, right? I think the goal for an organization should be to have like a full-blown incident response, DR, crisis management, leadership involved kind of set of exercises. But in many organizations, the maturity might not be there yet, right? So what I've seen a lot is on the business side, on the crisis management side of the house, a lot of those higher level tabletops occur, while at the same time, the organization's technical incident response capabilities are, maybe not as mature, but maturing over time, where eventually the goal should be that becomes an entire exercise framework.
Excellent, thanks. And a quick note that we actually have had a webinar on tabletops, and I should have mentioned earlier, also on risk assessment. So if you want to take a peek at those, get a little bit better sense of what you can do and how those run, feel free to take advantage of those as well. So quick point on organizational resilience. And this term, it ebbs and flows as far as the popularity of it, but we're certainly discussing a lot more now as to how are we going to be resilient and what does it actually mean. So like the body, similarly, we don't walk around with bubbles, although I saw some plastic bottles on people's heads and armor and that type of thing. We typically don't do that. So usually, our body defends ourselves by increasing the number of white blood cells and attacking those infections. And so, what do we do? How do we adapt and absorb what's happening to us so that we can, as it says, survive and prosper? So with that, talk to us a little bit about technology resilience.
Sure. So, some of these questions that organizations really need to ask themselves and kind of gauge themselves from a technology perspective is that, what happens all of a sudden now that a giant component or a giant percentage of the organization's user base is now working remotely, right? Well, how does that scale? Bottlenecks are going to be a huge issue. Whether it's VPN or just bandwidth, right? Bandwidth bottlenecks and limitations are really important from a recovery perspective. We've seen actually, not necessarily this, black swan pandemic level, but even bottlenecks from a bandwidth perspective related to being able to restore from offsite backups in the event of ransomware. So. Oh, great. We were able to contain this thing here, but it's still going to take 5 days to bring our databases back up to get, back into production. That could be a very big problem. Licensing, right? Now that we have a larger remote workforce, are we prepared for that? Do we have enough licenses for whatever, right? WebEx or Zoom or your chat platform of choice. And then, the last thing here is, how does this process change with alternate arrangements, right? On paper, right? On paper with a really solid business continuity plan, your processes probably aren't going to change, too much. But there's a lot of organizations that haven't done that level of work from a business continuity plan. So really, how does this new environment and taking into consideration all of these different technical things, how does that change process?
Yep. Yeah, and I would also just add on to this that, one of the things as you're adjusting different processes and changes, to this, be very careful about the security ramifications to this. Oftentimes, quick, does not, oftentimes could be incomplete. And, a great example of this is saying you're using a thick client, to do accounting, and now they're work from home. Are you going to poke open RDP so they can connect into that? That opens up other attack surfaces, to those type of scenarios. So be sure you're in those conversations to know, what's appropriate, from a response, and gauging that, and then putting in either alternate controls or monitoring solutions to make sure that it doesn't expose other stuff into that. Yeah.
100%. Yep.
So remote workforce, obviously there's, a percentage of the industries that can actually do remote workforce, and that's obviously being tested quite extensively right now. But a lot of our kind of tech jobs, out there have had various things of being able to remote workforce, and, oftentimes in financial sector, there have been a lot of remote work things, but I think it was just a year or two ago, they started pulling back a number to actually come back into the office and then loosening up again. But in this case here, having a remote workforce is great from a strategic position. So if the office is out of commission for whatever reason, which was, more the traditional things, saying, snowstorm, environmental conditions, or, in the case we're in with a pandemic where it's, you're doing the social distancing, being able to work remotely and do this and having the tools to do that is great, type of thing. But saying that, there are a number of different considerations as you start to deploy that. One of it is, how are you going to monitor from a security events perspective? So, typical, from organizations, they monitor at those certain gateways. So, whether your firewall has some type of IPS, module into it, or monitoring traffic from the VPN perspective. But what if your workforce isn't necessarily required to VPN in? How are you going to monitor those endpoints? So shifting from, the gateway to an endpoint, and having really both, as a kind of a layered approach, so that you're not missing all those employees that are actually working from home. And then, what requires a VPN? Back in the day, split tunneling was kind of the negative thing, but it really depends on the controls you have in place and whether you're monitoring that traffic. So if there's a way that you can actually still monitor from those endpoints, the traffic that's going in and out and what's going on those endpoints, then split tunneling might actually be appropriate. And you don't need all their web traffic and other different stuff to come through your corporate bottleneck of a VPN. You can actually just go straight out to, out their cable DSL modem with that and everything. Additionally, patches, if you have, patching being deployed internally from an organization, does that process continue to work being outside the home? On some implementation cases, I've seen that if you're not connected back through the VPN, they're not getting patches. So considering that, maybe they go back to Microsoft as kind of the thing, you might have, issues with patches, but that's going to be far less likely than, a vulnerability, coming down that they're not patched for, that's going to get exploited with that. And I shouldn't need to mention this since from a security perspective, we've been harping on this for years and years and years, but multi-factor authentication, anytime from an external point that you have employees logging into something, they should be required to do multi-factor authentication. Whether that's the vendor that has that actually employed, or whether you're, doing some single sign-on back into the organization. whatever it may be, this is a big deterrent from compromised passwords out there and reuse of passwords and logins. So definitely implement any type of tooling you put exposed out on the internet, put multi-factor in. And it's obviously a good idea internally as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. MFA.
Yeah.
The other aspect I think that's worth kind of bringing up is the training and policy aspect, right? So now you have an entire, sector or, percentage of your workforce that is not used to working from home and now working from home, making sure that their kids aren't like playing games on the corporate asset, corporate laptop. Things of that nature. So, I think, there's definitely an importance around training that newly remote workforce.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, because everything that from a corporate asset, could be monitored from a traffic. So do you trust your kids surfing the internet on your corporate asset? It's always a good question.
And the answer there should be no.
Yeah.
Anything in particular to look out for from a training perspective or from a remote workforce for your home networks? Anything of that sort?
Yeah, so I would say that from, there should be some guidelines for this. So new employees from a remote workforce might not know some of the etiquette, for this. And also what communication is good for and bad, so setting up, from an SLA perspective, if I send you an email, and this is good any time of the year, if I send you an email, what's your expected response time? If I send you a Slack message, what's your expected response time? And communicating that out to the organization to help with that. Also, too, if you're doing video, there should be some etiquette. I saw somebody complaining on LinkedIn that they were doing a video conference and they're like, hey, we should still have appropriate attire with this. And that means put on a shirt when you're communicating with other employees. So just kind of setting out kind of corporate guidelines, to say, hey, we don't mind if you're in your sweats, but, you should be clothed, type of thing. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, we did a whole training on that one time because of so many issues. It was pretty incredible.
Yep. And actually, one other thing, I was talking with my next door neighbor yesterday, and they have about a workforce of 800 devs that, for whatever reason, they really never work from home. And a lot of them are kind of mid-20s-ish, type of thing. He was telling me that, I think it was today, he was doing a big webinar to all of them on how to effectively work from home, to all these different people with that. So yeah, it is important to kind of set guidelines with it. And actually the next slide is actually an article from the DoD that if you guys look this up from the standpoint, they were saying they were having a big bottleneck problem of what we're mentioning, but one of the things that they were looking at is blocking YouTube and social media and all this stuff. So they force everybody to kind of VPN in, and then all this streaming activity, Netflix, was basically eating up all their bandwidth type of thing. So, setting kind of appropriateness of, you shouldn't be doing this during work, hours from this, and, definitely don't be VPNing in to do that is, setting those type of expectations is important.
Well, we had to throw in a pew pew map.
Pew pew.
But realistically, the point here is, there's other stuff going on. There's outside of a crisis like a pandemic. There's still business as usual, mostly financially motivated, organized crime, attempting to breach systems, make their profits, etc. And realistically, now we have to talk about what is really right. So the low probability, high impact black swan event, right? The black swan events are really those, those things like we're in right now where, something, it's typically not fiscally viable to really, really prepare for a black swan event. But what, like Justin was speaking to earlier, now we have, let's just say, tens of thousands of organizations that are ramping up their remote access capabilities for a newly kind of remote workforce. And those things are probably, those controls are probably going to be spun up fairly quickly. This is a really big concern of mine, right? Because we have a pandemic, we have a black swan, but now we have just a ton of additional threat multipliers because of that giant attack surface that just appeared overnight with potentially misconfigured remote access, RDP, VPN, et cetera, to rapidly respond to the need for this new remote workforce. That's a big concern of mine.
Yep. Yeah. And I would also put on to this that, in this case where we're dealing with kind of a pandemic, and obviously the numbers aren't huge right now, but one of the things that this is causing other organizations to think about is what happens if some core individuals are out, type of thing. And what happens if my entire IT team is out, with that. So thinking about, first off, cross training with different individuals. So there might be some developers that can do IT services and vice versa with that, looking to outside help, from different organizations. Also to looking at a clear succession role and responsibilities and some of those critical roles within the organization, that if somebody's out, who else is in charge and who can make those calls, type of thing.
Yeah. And from an economic perspective, right? We know that there are just, gobs and gobs of businesses right now that are going to be feeling, they're going to be hurting, over the next number of months because of this, the black swan pandemic. Multiply that by, and also we just got hit with ransomware.
Yeah.
That's a bad day.
That's a bad day. So what can you do today? So we talked about all the kind of precursors and what you've been doing all along this, but if you don't have any of this, and this is the first time kind of considering it because of this event here, what are some of the, quick wins that you can look at to, help to actually ease this into remote workforce or something like that? So if bottlenecks exist, limit it to only essential traffic. So looking at maybe you weren't blocking some of the kind of other services out, but maybe it's appropriate now to lessen the burden on some of those bottleneck issues. So no YouTube, social media, things of that nature, things that aren't important to your business. Cloud services, looking at them to alleviate some of the data heavy tools. So I mentioned file shares and everything. One thing I do want to put it like a little asterisk next to this is that doesn't mean that somebody just creates a service real quick and throws it out there. There has to still be some monitoring and due diligence from a security perspective that, if anybody can flip, a folder to public, that's bad. We don't want to compound security issues with already dealing with, business continuity issues as well, and that would just, like we mentioned, the double black swan type of thing, but this is shooting yourself in the foot. So be cautious when you're doing this, but they can alleviate some of the data load. If you have an internal file share, you can move it to a Dropbox or Box or something like that and help to alleviate some of that heavy data transferred back to corporate. Implementing security monitoring on the endpoints, we mentioned about that. It's definitely a good thing. If you haven't done that and you're just using the traditional, AV products with that, it's definitely a good time to consider this. I know our sister company, we just had a meeting, last weekend before, and they were mentioning that they can actually roll out to an organization within hours or days, that it's very simple to actually put their monitoring solution into that. And all of a sudden your entire workforce is monitored from an MSSP perspective. So those are just some considerations, when doing this. Another thing, increased communication, assistance with newly remote workforce. We kind of mentioned this a little bit. There's a lot of people that are being pushed out of their comfort zone. There's a lot of different processes that weren't meant to be fully remote or remote for this long distance. So making sure you're fully communicating from that regular touch point to also individuals, reaching out to other team members, see how they're doing, bubble up problems up to management so that they can address it or at least put in consideration on, getting the tools you need, getting other stuff with that. Some of the stuff I've heard from, different organizations, and it's rapidly changing, but, organizations have been doing, stipends for internet for companies that weren't remote to help them kind of get up to speed, doing nice things of, stipends for like date nights, type of thing. I've heard from companies doing that, if you take your wife or kids out to a nice restaurant once a week to help, do that, or take food out or something along that lines with it. And lastly, I wanted to mention, if you're concerned about your workforce or the, being out, there are other organizations that you can kind of implement retainers for. Obviously, our incident response team is actually getting busier. As Rocky mentioned, there's a lot of different threat actors that are taking advantage to this current scenario here. But looking at that so that you can reserve your spot in case you need them. Also to remediation from an IT perspective, if you're concerned about that, having services that you can reach out to augment for, service disruption inside your organization.
And the only thing that I tack onto this, and I know it's not technically a quick win, and especially depending on the size of an organization, but we mentioned it earlier, right? MFA. Multi-factor authentication is going to go a long way to reduce the likelihood of some type of credential breach, and then resulting in unauthorized access to corporate assets and data. So there's that as well.
So a couple of questions have come up. So could you review again a little bit more in depth on split tunneling? VPN says it can be a quick win for bottleneck for remote workers, but it obviously is against some of the compliance regulations, et cetera. Just start from the beginning. What is it, and how do you implement it, and what are the risks and concerns?
Yep. Yeah. So full tunnel is when you do a VPN connection, that 100% of your traffic goes back to and through your corporate VPN. Split tunneling is when the only thing that's coming back to your corporate entity is the services you need. So if you have an internal portal that you need to get to or a file share internally, it's reaching over the VPN for that. But if you're just going out to the internet or doing other stuff out to that, it's using just the internet connection from the home with that perspective there. And there have been some that from a compliance perspective that, said, hey, you shouldn't use split tunneling. But the real core of the issue is that traffic is not monitored, but you can get that monitored through different services. Like I know we're using a service that actually monitors web traffic remotely, that basically puts an agent as kind of a proxy and goes through that proxy on the internet, with that through another company. That can be done, and you're monitoring basically both types. It might not be coming back over your corporate, it's going out to another data service, but both are covered with that. And that accomplishes the intent of the control.
Excellent, thanks. What about stress testing? Any cloud-based video conferencing solutions before you use them? It says many are having performance problems due to load, and Slack specifically has a 15-person limit. I know you talked about a little bit with QoS, but could you expand on some of the things that you should be doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, when you're engaging with different vendors, you should always look at some of the services and how they can scale out with that. Obviously, companies like Zoom and Slack are definitely going under the stress test. But we're using Zoom right now, and it's working fine. I think they've scaled out pretty rapidly to handle the extra workload. And depending on the service, like I know Slack is a limit from video sharing with that, but there are other services that you can kind of go on top of. Like Zoom has, I forget what the limit is, 100, 500, from the paid version on its base. I don't know if you guys remember that, but anyways, that's pretty large, to handle, a shared communication platform. So those are considerations when you're kind of engaging into those vendors to say, okay, for each one of the teams, for their team members, Slack might be fine, so there'll be pretty much nobody over 16 people on a particular team. But then when you're doing company wide, maybe you switch a medium to a Zoom or something along that lines. So.
Great. So again, can you prioritize the tools or software that you would need, maybe that would move up the stack? You talked about MFA, remote. What were those maybe 3 to 5 tools or software that you could move up the list if you are able to get extra budget because of the pandemic?
I would start with, multi-factor authentication, some type of monitoring services, and likely investment in an endpoint detection and response solution. Those would be my 3.
Yeah, purely from a security perspective, I would agree. So, looking at CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, type implementation, multi-factor monitoring, those are, from a security budget perspective, going to be your best bets. From an organizational perspective, I would also look at, how, it depends on the industry, but how the organization is kind of designed. So do you have servers sitting in an office somewhere to handle that, or are you into Office 365? And I know a number of organizations have moved to that, but it makes it so much easier to respond in a situation like this if you can deal with those tools remotely to manage those remote assets. And you're basically shifting it from kind of the eggshell retainer to, the, zero trust out there, but basically an endpoint has to be authenticated, before doing anything.
Another one, back to split tunneling. You can do split tunneling on an exception basis. How you can send everything through the tunnel except chatty ranges like those used for YouTube, etc. Having Suricata, Bro, etc., and the egress of the VPN can help in this area. Any other comments on split tunneling from an exception basis?
No,
those are.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Prek.
I was just going to say those are great. Those are great points. 100%.
Okay, and we'll run up against it. What do you say, and specifically to a CEO, or what things would you put together in your plan or communication plan up of the things that you're doing?
So from the technical perspective, this is where, kind of the liaison role of like a chief information security officer is really, really important. On paper, working with the chief information officer, but having the technical knowledge of what those teams are doing and being able to utilize things like metrics that are coming out of these tools and these teams, and being able to effectively communicate back into what is basically business speak or dollars, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the alignment of the business with the protection of critical data is so important.
Yep. Yeah, and I would also put on to that, before you even talking about dollars, deciding strategically how you want to organize your data and manage your different services out there. So do you feel comfortable moving stuff into the cloud? If the answer is a solid no, then there's going to be, ramifications to that decision. If it's yes, there's security aspects that you have to adjust to ensure properly that you're putting security and compliance into those environments. So it's not a right or wrong answer. It makes it easier from this point of view to deal with situations like this if you're more diverse into your technology stack. But if you're saying like we have to have everything in-house and managed, then you have to just consider that and say, okay, here are the limitations to how we're going to operate. We have to have a VPN tunnel that's, you know, going to handle a workload, you know, of this sort. And if that's the decision, then here are the costs associated with it.
All right, I know we're up against it, so I want to thank everyone for joining, and really want to thank Rockie and Justin for putting this together. I know it was short term, last minute. We expected on Monday to have a different type of webinar, but really appreciate your time in pulling this together and answering a lot of questions for us.
Yeah,
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Take care.
See you,
Thanks
everyone.
again. Bye-bye.
Take care.